if we can invite Khensani de Klerk, who is an architecture designer and planner from Johannesburg. Her efforts are centered on gender empowerment and architecture industry and practicing intersectionally through practice research.
Firstly, thank you so much to the Architecture Foundation and the Asian Association for Architects. This has been an incredible, already learning and unlearning process. I think that's the quest for self-awareness in education that we focus on a lot at Matri-Archi and that I do myself. So to just add into the introduction, thank you, Carl. So I'm currently doing an MPhil at the University of Cambridge. I wear another hat where I am the founder and co-director of Matri-Architecture, which is a collective. We call ourselves an intersectional collective. We're in many different locations across the world, but we're predominantly based between South Africa and Switzerland. And we're kind of our efforts are geared towards empowering African women in architecture through spatial education. And we sort of action our ethos through our research unit and a forthcoming sort of spatial education program, because we very much so only learned about nuanced knowledge and our own cultures through our own efforts. And so we're trying to sort of intervene in that very difficult space. And so I will just begin by playing recalling an interview by, just to mention, I'm from Johannesburg, South Africa. This is very important in the context of this lecture or this contribution. And so I'll begin by recalling an interview from 2016 by a Dr. Luazi Lushaba, who was or is a lecturer in political studies at the University of Cape Town, and was a very active Black professor during the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall protests in 2015 and 2016. And the sound clip that I'm about to play is a clip that's remixed by Bonolo Thomas, who's founded a collective called Under Pressure Sundays in South Africa. They focus a lot on sort of archiving histories, and this is also something very important that's been highlighted in the previous presentations, which is oral transmission. And so I'm going to play this, and then we're going to unpack.
So it so happened that I am a Black person who teaches in a white institution that is anti-Black called the University of Cape Town. The foundation of this institution, as it is with many other white institutions in this country and their institutional cultures, is such that they do not have categories and perspectives with which to apprehend Black modes of cognizing and Black modes of being in the world. Their categories of knowledge, their forms of knowing, their forms of teaching are only geared towards Western forms of life. In simpler terms, they are geared towards urban forms of life. So the only forms of knowledge about Black people that are able to enter these universities and these institutions are those forms of lives of Black people that turn Black people away from themselves, are those forms of life that make Black people despise themselves, that make Black people begin to speak ill of their culture, that make Black people to begin to detest their own languages, that make Black people at the end of their studies not to be able to speak their languages. So what happens at UCT is that I began teaching there at the beginning of this year, and I felt a need as a Black person to bring into the classrooms forms of knowledge that were previously excluded by these institutions. What I did was basically not something out of this world. I invited into my first year class of politics, Introduction to Political Science, RMF activists. Now, these were people who last year had been involved at UCT, driven by their selflessness, driven by their unconditional love for themselves and for Black people, who had been involved in struggles to change the institutional culture at UCT. And I thought that it was going to be useful to my first year students to engage with these RMF activists, not to agree with them, but to critically engage with them so that they would hear for themselves from the actual dramatis personae, those who were involved in Rhodes Must Fall, as to what decolonizing higher education meant for them, as to how these activists, these Black activists, who, as I've said, are driven by an unconditional love for the land, and unconditional love for Black people, how they experienced state violence, how they were criminalized, suspended, and ultimately some of them expelled from the university. So they came to class. They taught these first-year students revolutionary songs. Now, one of the ways in which Black people transmit knowledge is through song and dance.
I'll pause there because it's quite a long clip, which I would encourage everyone to listen to. I'll drop the link in the chat box afterwards. But just to continue. So just to mention that, you know, a lot of this is repetitive. I'm thinking of Sana's lecture because you specifically said through song and dance, which I found is quite perfect to follow from there. But something that I think is quite important to mention when sort of speaking on this is that I can only speak from where I come from, as all of us can. And I suppose that's the places and the people that I've encountered. And of course, one of those sites that molds each of us in this institution is the institution or the academy, the university, whatever you want to call it. And it has been the priming model that puts us in tension, us othered, typically othered from institutions, that puts us in tension with ourselves, given the awareness that we have of the disconnect from our othered selves against the sort of backdrop of the self, which is seen to be the objective sort of Western educational model. And this tension, of course, matters as we're congregating here today about it, and it should matter to the institution because the world is diversifying at a very rapid rate. And the knowledges we exchange in education should teach us to critically engage with that diverse world, right? And not just in terms of curricula, but as Dr. Luazi Lushaba shared with us, also outside of Western modes of rationality, learning and teaching as a form of exchange rather than this sort of service-based giving and taking that is very much so the capitalistic product of the institution. And we are trying to better the institution through collectivizing. And that's why I've sort of created this presentation around the sort of proliferation of collectivizing that's happening right now, and it's happening again and again as we see it. And those of us othered in institutions, including those othered knowledges, live a sort of Du Boisian experience, right? An existence that is what Bell Hooks would refer to, of course, as both margin and center. There are some images here to show the treatment of that Rhodes statue and to speak about this Du Boisian existence that those of us othered in institutions face is to also explain that the sort of consciousness of having an in-depth understanding of both Western history, but also having a yearning towards the knowledges that are of our own culture, very nuanced and ancestral histories that we don't know too much about because of this Western-centric dominating and overpowering, not just institution, but practice reproduces that just as much. And so it is the returning to education, education that influences our understandings of the world and ourselves. And that is why when we describe the institution, we describe it as overpowering and dominating because it posits modernity as something objectively advanced with the explicit absence of other ways of being and other ways of reproduction, like oral histories and teaching and archiving. And that makes us very cautious of what it means to accessorize and attach these new forms of supposedly new forms of knowledge production in a contemporary sense. But I suppose at Matri-Archi and through my own lens, we remain extremely inspired by many of the projects that have been mentioned in this presentation thus far, and particularly one that comes to mind that hasn't been mentioned is the sort of archive of forgetfulness, which is being run by Huda Teya, but along with many other incredible spatial practitioners. And of course, the sort of constellation projects initiated by Susie Hall, Tandi Lowenson, and Huda as well at the called race-based in architecture. And so these are seen to be other ways of thinking, but what does it mean to adopt them into an institution that constantly absorbs them or erases them? And so the act of decolonizing, and I use decolonizing and not decolonization because that sort of alludes to something that is kept in a sort of chronology of how we live, but the act of decolonizing, that is, of course, an unending, as we see it today, process that seeks to unfold and radically reconnect our othered lives with our lives that we, inhabit today. Those othered lives, of course, hold incredibly rich and innovative spatial knowledge. And so one of the biggest question remains is how to bring those othered lives to contemporary knowledge and practice in a way that is radically recognized, I'll unpack this later, as equally advanced to that which we acknowledge in the institution today. Of course, this need to connect or acknowledge diversity as it stands has been picked up by multiple institutions, and in many ways meaningful and in some ways not meaningful. We can identify that this happens in the proliferation of talks. I mean, this is a meaningful one, but in the proliferation of talks and sort of co-opting and accessorization that relegates our initiatives to extramurals, that relegates our initiatives to ancillary projects. And so one sort of sees these initiatives as the base work glossary for the beginning of a very long process, which we are in this decolonizing, this process of decolonizing. And I've just put this here because these are references that I constantly go to, and I'd like to particularly point to Legacy Russell's Glitch Feminism, where she speaks about the glitch as an act or a reawakening that shakes a system. You know, when you glitch a system, it can no longer function until the problem has been addressed. And so this sort of calls, this moment, these punctures to the system call for it to be thought in its entirety. And I mean, of course, that does not mean that it should be erased, because it's that erasure that is recorded in history and that we ourselves as others often or constantly trudge within, attempting to glean forgotten and overlooked knowledges that are currently in patches. But the glitch as remix becomes important, as she puts it, as remix, as we are ourselves products of remixes. We can't undo colonialism, but we can remix, and that is another way in which we, and when I say we, I often speak about Matri-Archi, look at decolonizing. The remix is a creative act, turning methods, content, and practice completely upside down and experimenting with intentions to better ourselves with an awareness of social sustainability in mind. I suppose a good way to describe this is that, you know, yes, the world is diversifying, and this, of course, could be seen as an opportunity for those cosmopolitan cities whose nations pride themselves on the results of the efforts, energy, and presence of their diverse communities. Of course, if you took every immigrant, expat, foreigner, whatever you want to call us, out of London, ancestrally as well, what would that look like? And one thinks of the counter spaces, forthcoming Serpentine Pavilion, and how it also points to the undeniable DNA of diverse communities that constitutes London today. We see this sort of act of collectivizing in the supposed mundanity of everyday life. And, you know, this Afayina de Jong also speaks about this at length in the form of hanging out. Of course, we know it today as the barbershop or braiding your hair on the streets, communities meeting in restaurants after hours. These are all collective practices in everyday life that are used as mechanisms for survival and safety, or as Carl Kossegard might call alternative space. Nancy Fraser's also spoken about that at length. And I don't particularly like to use the term BAME, but I do think that as a sort of overarching, in the sake of naming a group that is extremely diverse with nuanced experiences, because the non-white people tend to be excluded from the traditional Western model of public space. that is to be seen as objective, these spaces are becoming more and more common. And we then ask ourselves how these spaces don't only serve as a space of resistance to that, and not just a space of reclamation, but how that can be a proactive thing that we start to encourage as spatial practitioners who, let's say, officially have the capacity to design and to record knowledge. So there's a responsibility that comes into this act of decolonizing. And those who have an awareness of culture, of course, and those who can open up spaces for learning about that culture are authors that are not necessarily present in spatial practice, or not as present as we'd hope. And I do want to caveat that culture in the sense is not gates kept, but access does come through culture, and culture is a fluctuating blueprint in the sense that there is no fixed solution. And the idea of a blueprint in that sense is always in flux and accessible to those who can see it and who live within it and that it embodies. And radical recognition in, following this in the architectural industry requires a sort of opening up within the industry to value diverse content and methods, which all have endless blueprints, that which is seen by those most equipped with the knowledge to see. And legibility and narrating becomes quintessential to this process, and is something that I've particularly been doing through my own research at the University of Cambridge, listening carefully to the narratives of survivors of gender-based violence in Cape Town as a departing point for understanding the existing issues and the existing ideas before even touching my preconceived notions of what safety might appear to be. Yes, so in this sense, of course, storytelling is very much so to understand the blueprints with nuanced experiences, and to mention that understanding all of these blueprints is impossible, nor is it the task, because we are so diverse, but visualizing these blueprints allows us to see the overlays and intersections that give us all new design parameters for creating in a socially sustainable way. So how do we start seeing ourselves as narrators or conduits and vessels for what already exists and is already, let's say, latent with value? And those words keep coming up, conduits and vessel, at least in my own personal work, in that archiving and communicating these stories becomes a very ethical sort of mode of practice, thinking about when to protect the identities of those involved and to adapt to the paces of those involved, rather than the other way around, which we're traditionally taught in architecture to kind of go into the field, capture, go into the field, ask, extract and leave. And somehow, how do we think about doing that from a completely different method, centering care as a priority? And so I suppose I just presented that example because it is one of the many projects happening across a constellation of collectives that are taking it upon themselves to come together and experiment in spaces that they have created themselves. It's a very generous act, and it's an incredibly tiring act, to work against a system that does not recognize its value and therefore does not sustain it in financial terms. The characteristic of most collectives coming up as self-initiated non-profit organizations would traditionally look like an extra. That's a privilege, but in fact, it's the complete opposite. These two images, or three images, are recalling what happened in the midst of that 2016 Fees Must Fall protest, where APG stands for Architecture, Planning and Geomatics, where students and lecturers, academics came together to try and find ways to rethink the curriculum in response to this crisis. These happenings, or these gatherings, or what you would call an imbizo, these happened outside for 3 months, 3 times a week, whilst the institution completely shut down. And so it was a really interesting place to troubleshoot openly, and to also acknowledge that, as Janine França would say, that we should perhaps be thinking about moving from safe spaces to brave spaces, where there's a little bit of risk involved, and how to strategically place risk on those who will be least affected by that, because there's no risk-free scenario, unfortunately. And so this really was an interesting way of us thinking about what free open discourse meant, and that kind of culminated into a statement and a letter and a list of demands from the director's office of the School of Architecture, which we with the consent of the director at the time, Thoma Belanda, decided to say the director's office as a collective, which was a really unifying moment at the School of Architecture, and has had very wonderful implications or effects today. But what I think this speaks a lot to is that this proliferation of collectives is not privilege at all, but it's rather a result of the resourcefulness of other groups using existing formal structures to mobilize and collectivize now, as a way to also resist the forceful tension of forgetfulness being taught in traditional canonical architectural schools, and consequently producing a standard of architecture that benchmarks itself to that education which omits the other, but claims to and has to house other communities in the built environment. So it's quite a conundrum, and incremental change does mean a lot, and it is positive to see the effects of these sorts of informal happenings. On the left, you will see the poster to a sort of class or a series of classes hosted by Fadli Isaacs, Sadiq Tofa, and Ian Lowe in the midst of the 2016 protest, and really an example of those in and of the institution using the resources that are available to them, rather than shifting responsibility. Who does it all? We all have a role to play, I would argue. I just put this here because I constantly draw inspiration from Bell Hooks' essay titled Black Vernacular Architecture's Cultural Practice, published in 1995 in a book called Art on My Mind. And I suppose I'll read the last line, which is that thinking about a more expansive understanding of architecture allows critics to theorize our experience in ways that promote documentation, or the documentation of our historical and contemporary relationship to space and aesthetics. And so at Matri-Archi, this is a snippet from one of our videos that you can find on our websites. Yeah, I suppose collectives, as we see it, are not only spaces of resistance, but also spaces of exploration, proposition, subversion, upgrading, critique, all developing methods of practice premised on intersectionality and an ethics of care. The Architectural Review recently published their March issue on care, where I was honored to write a piece drawing from Judith Butler's Force of Nonviolence and Bell Hooks' essay that I just took a snippet out of, and really thinking about how care in spatial practice is about an ethos of interdependency. We all rely on one another, and that which reads every brief and drives every project with what Butler would term as breathability, that is to mean, or that means that I value my life as I would value yours, and you value your life as you would value mine. And so I think that this sort of becomes more evident in the sustainability discourse, but should be seen equally important in the social sustainability agenda. And yeah, I suppose that collectivizing as an act gives visibility to the blueprints of activity and cultural nuance that could inform the thickness and the curve and the length of that line. Of course, collectivizing is a mechanism for sharing that allows those spatial practitioners, I would argue a lot of us that are here today, to journey in a sort of self-awareness and increase our consciousness of the world. And so it's really an opportunity which is sadly relegated by institutions and governments to disruptive groups attempting to dent the objective status quo. And I'll not even put this here for more than 2 minutes, because this is an example of that sort of anti-discourse happening today. And so begging for radical recognition, that is to say, aggrievability of not just our lives, but our knowledges, collectives are spaces of prototype which continue to do transformative work with limited means, often responding to institutional ills that institutions are not designed to react to due to their slow or rigid frameworks. And so many collectives like this come to mind who are sort of in between the space of student and practitioner. Sound advice, I'll just skip through this really fast, you know, Now What, and Why Think Tank, who are also an inspiring duo, who are all producing assets that could help institutions transform. And it's really interesting to see it from the side of being led within the institution, which I find inspiring at UCL, and then at the same time, how to adopt existing initiatives that are producing these assets. It's a terrible term, but the question, of course, always results in what do we do now? What do we do now? And during the parity talks, the 5th parity talks at the ETH, Solange Mbanefo, who I co-direct Matri-Archi with, she's a practicing architect in Switzerland, we represented Matri-Archi giving a lecture on research as practice, and we concluded on a point which I'd like to bring up again here in conclusion, which is that you know, in the space of adoption and absorption lies an opportunity where institutions as enablers, financial gatekeepers, also verifying stamp clerks for future commissions, are able to affect change by radically recognizing collective action through consultant and partner relationships to the institution. While the institution incrementally transforms at an unfortunate slow rate that it can, as it was never designed to change or remold itself. This was never their intention. And so, you know, in practical terms, there are tons of ideas. You know, when institutions invite collectives or people to speak, pay them to do that, you'll be surprised how many don't. When you know, alternative discourse is discussed in reference lists, who helps the sort of students learn how to read, learn how to think about different forms of cognizance, because those references are then relegated to something that is accessorized and seen as an extramural. I'm quite inspired by a lot of student movements as well. And I thought to also put this here because that's an incredible initiative happening at Manchester School of Architecture. And, you know, also a call to both those in and of the institution to not wait for the institution to make an opportunity, but to create it, you know, for yourself. But of course, students are ephemeral, paying to be in institutions. But those working in the institution are also of the institution. And so the ripple effects of radical recognition will without a doubt change the nature of work in the industry, putting much needed focus on the social vitality of our shared futures, whilst of course paying respect to reparations, which is a completely different topic in itself. And so I'm going to end on this slide because I can only speak from where I come from. And also to mention that Matri-Archi is currently building a digital constellation of collectives and happenings, which hope to show in a very interactive way the constantly fluctuating relationships and richness of initiatives that are active today outside of the discourse of what gets seen, right? We are interested in the now as a constant conversation between our histories and our futures, and curious to see how initiatives are interacting and will interact, given that other students who once protested or who are now protesting are also now qualifying and becoming qualified, even though we remain the minority significantly. And it's an incredible and active space to be in, this sort of collective proliferation. But of course, everything requires energy. Therefore, sustainability and care, which safeguard and maintain our energy, are critical to transformation and development in education and practice. And so I veered away from giving sort of practical tick box solutions to what a blueprint tends to be seen as, because there are plenty, but I think that at the core of that is a sustainability that recognizes our efforts, interests, and labor, or else it just gets relegated to an accessory and an extramural. And that's it from me.